The soft, warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows of their cozy Austin home, casting a golden hue across the living room. It was a typical evening, quiet, peaceful, filled with the kind of stillness that came with routine. Samantha, 32, stood in the kitchen, busy chopping vegetables for dinner. The aroma of sautéed garlic and onions filled the air, but her mind was elsewhere. She had just received the call of a lifetime, an offer to lead a groundbreaking architectural project in London. The opportunity was everything she had dreamed of, a chance to take her career to new heights, to prove herself on an international stage. "Tom, you won't believe this," she called out, her voice bubbling with excitement. Tom, her 36-year-old husband, emerged from the bedroom, his brow furrowed as he wiped his hands on his jeans. His eyes softened when he saw her glowing face. He had been used to her career-driven intensity, but tonight, there was something different in her energy, a certain urgency. "What's going on, Sam?" he asked, taking a step toward her. Samantha turned to face him, her eyes sparkling. "I got the London project. It's official. They want me to lead it. It's everything I've worked for. Can you believe it?" Tom's smile faltered for a brief second. His heart sank, though he quickly masked it with a supportive expression. He had always known that Samantha was destined for greatness, and yet, the thought of her moving overseas, of the distance it would create between them, struck him with an unfamiliar weight. "That's amazing, Sam," he said, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "But, London, that's a huge move." Samantha's face lit up even more. "I know. It's going to be such a great adventure. We'll make it work, right? We always do." Tom's mind raced. He wanted to be happy for her. This was a career-defining moment for his wife. But as he looked around their home, the life they had built together over the past 8 years, something inside him bristled. He wasn't sure how he felt about the distance that would now define their marriage. "I don't know, Sam," Tom murmured, his voice quieter now. "It's just a big change, you know? We've got everything here. Our lives, our friends. I just don't want us to lose what we have." His tone was heavy, and though he tried to smile, his concern was impossible to hide. Samantha paused, her knife hovering above the cutting board. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Tom, are you saying you're not supportive of this?" Tom's heart tightened. He quickly shook his head, trying to explain. "No, of course not. I don't want it to come at the cost of us. You know how things are sometimes when we're apart for too long. I'm just worried about what this might do to us." Samantha exhaled, her frustration brewing under the surface. "You think I'm going to put my career first, at the cost of our marriage? Tom, we've always known this would be a part of my journey. We knew what this would mean." She turned back to the stove, focusing on the meal, though the spark of enthusiasm had dimmed slightly. Tom stood still, watching her. He felt the weight of the decision pulling him in 2 different directions. He loved her more than anything, and he wanted to support her dreams. But the fear of change, of the emotional distance that would come with it, gnawed at him. "I'll support you," he finally said, his voice softer. "You know I will. But we need to figure out how we're going to make this work. This is a big step." Samantha gave him a smile, though it seemed tinged with uncertainty. "We will. I'll be back often, and we'll talk every day. We can make it work." Later that evening, they sat down to dinner, the table set with candles flickering softly. As they ate, their conversation shifted back to mundane things, work, their favorite TV shows, plans for the weekend. But there was an unspoken tension, a quiet undercurrent of doubt that neither of them fully acknowledged. They both knew that the road ahead would be more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Samantha's career was taking flight, but the cost was beginning to show in ways they hadn't prepared for. And while Tom agreed to support her, deep down, he feared that the distance would grow between them, quietly and relentlessly, until they no longer recognized what they had. As they finished their meal, their laughter fading into silence, neither of them spoke the words that lingered in the air. Would their marriage survive this change? Would their love withstand the weight of their sacrifices? Only time would tell. Samantha's new apartment in London was sleek and modern, a far cry from the warmth of their Austen home. The city's vibrant pulse could be heard faintly from her high-rise window, a constant reminder of the life she was beginning to build without Tom by her side. She had embraced the opportunity with open arms, excited by the prestige of the project and the challenges that awaited her. But as the days passed, she couldn't ignore the gnawing emptiness of her solitude. Her apartment was filled with pristine furniture and clean lines, but it lacked the familiar touch of Tom's presence. There were no photos of their travels together or the little mementos that marked their shared experiences. It was a place designed for one, and while it was everything she had hoped for professionally, it began to feel more like a cage than a sanctuary. Back in Austen, Tom had spent his days in the quiet stillness of their home. The silence was suffocating, and the routine he had relied on for years now felt like a burden. He tried to keep busy, catching up on work, reconnecting with old friends, but nothing could fill the space that Samantha's absence had carved out in his life. The phone calls had started strong, each conversation brimming with excitement as Samantha shared her triumphs. But as the weeks wore on, the calls grew shorter, less frequent. Work pressures mounted on both sides. Samantha's days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant hum of her new life, while Tom's evenings stretched long with no one to share them with. One evening, after another rushed call where Samantha apologized for not being able to talk longer, Tom sat alone at the kitchen table. His phone vibrated with a message from Sarah, a mutual friend who had always been close to both of them. Tom hesitated, then opened the message. "Hey, just wanted to let you know. I've heard things about Samantha and Mark, her new colleague. I'm not sure what's going on, but they've been spending a lot of time together. Just thought you should know." Tom's stomach tightened, and his fingers hovered over the phone for a long moment. He had never been the jealous type, but a wave of doubt washed over him. He tried to push it away. After all, this was all hearsay. But in the quiet of his empty house, the seed of suspicion had been planted. He stared at the screen for a while, the words blurring as his thoughts spiraled. Had the distance really made her grow closer to someone else? The thought unsettled him, but he didn't want to confront her with accusations without knowing more. Still, the emotional distance between them was becoming unbearable. They were both losing touch in ways they hadn't prepared for. That weekend, Samantha had promised to come home for a visit. She had been looking forward to it, excited at the idea of returning to Austen, even if only for a few days. But as the days slipped by, Tom received a message from her. "I'm so sorry, but I need to cancel this weekend. We've had a major setback with the project, and I can't leave right now. I promise I'll make it up to you soon." Tom sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the text, the words stinging more than they should have. It wasn't the first time she'd canceled, but this time it felt different. It felt like another step away from the life they had built. He tried to understand. Work was demanding, she was trying to make her mark, and he didn't want to stand in the way. But it was hard not to feel abandoned. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional gulf between them deepened. Tom found himself alone more often than not, grappling with his growing frustration. He missed Samantha terribly, but the resentment was beginning to seep in, a quiet, insidious thing that festered beneath the surface. On a rainy afternoon, Tom received another text, this one from Sarah. "Just checking in. I know you're probably busy, but I think you need to know that I saw Samantha and Mark at lunch again today. They were very close. It didn't look professional." Tom's heart raced, and a chill ran through him. The doubts he had tried to ignore were now impossible to escape. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something he couldn't control. He was losing her, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. He closed his phone and leaned back in the chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had trusted her, believed in their bond, but now everything seemed fragile, as if it could shatter with just a word, a glance, or an unexpected twist. The distance between them wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, growing by the day, and Tom wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on before it all fell apart. In London, Samantha stood by the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. She missed him too, but she couldn't deny the allure of the life she was building, the excitement of the project, the new people she was meeting, and the thrill of making a name for herself in a city that was all about ambition. She had always been driven, always known that her career would come first, but now, for the first time, she wondered if she had sacrificed too much. Would she be able to fix this, to find her way back to Tom? Or had the distance already created a rift too deep to bridge? As the hours stretched on, neither of them had the answers, only the growing tension that would define the chapters of their future. Tom had always prided himself on being the understanding husband, the one who gave Samantha the freedom to pursue her dreams. But as the days turned into weeks, the growing silence between them became unbearable. The text messages, the fleeting phone calls, the cold distance. All of it began to gnaw at him in a way he couldn't ignore. The seed of doubt that had been planted when Sarah first mentioned Samantha's closeness with Mark now felt like a creeping vine, choking the trust he once held so firmly. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He had tried to convince himself that everything would be okay, that Samantha was just busy with work. But his intuition, that nagging voice at the back of his mind, told him otherwise. So, without warning, he booked a flight. He didn't tell her, didn't even mention it to anyone else. He needed answers, answers he was too afraid to ask over the phone. It was a risk, a gamble, but his heart couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. As he stepped off the plane and into the London terminal, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The city was alive with energy, its skyline stretching high above him, just as it had for Samantha in her new life. It felt both foreign and familiar, an echo of what had once been their shared dreams. But now it was a reminder of everything that had changed. He took a cab to her apartment, the one that once promised to be a home for both of them. The sleek, modern building was as cold and imposing as it had seemed in her descriptions. As he entered the lobby and waited for the elevator, Tom's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a confrontation he had been dreading for months. When he arrived at her flat, the door was unlocked. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of her perfume filling the air. His heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, everything was still. The quiet hum of the city beyond the windows, the soft click of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. He had expected her to be at work, but the apartment was eerily silent. As he made his way toward the living room, a sound stopped him in his tracks. A low, intimate laugh. His heart skipped a beat. It was Samantha's voice, but it wasn't alone. He froze, pressing himself against the wall as he strained to listen. The conversation was muffled, but it was unmistakable. Samantha and Mark were talking, their words blending together in a way that made Tom's blood run cold. "Yeah, I've missed this," Samantha said, her voice tinged with something he hadn't heard in months, genuine warmth. "It's nice to just relax for a change." Mark's voice followed, quieter, almost a whisper. "It's good to see you unwind. I've been thinking about you a lot." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Tom didn't need to hear more. He didn't want to hear more, but his feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him into the living room. There they were, Samantha and Mark, sitting close on the couch, their proximity unmistakable. Mark's hand rested on Samantha's, their eyes locked in a way that told Tom everything he needed to know. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of his realization. Samantha's eyes widened in shock when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was deafening. "Tom," Samantha said, her voice strained. What are you doing here?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He could barely find his voice, his emotions swirling inside him like a storm. He had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw hurt that surged through him now. "Is this what's been going on?" Tom finally asked, his voice breaking. This is why we've been drifting apart? Why you've been so distant?" Samantha stood up quickly, as if she had been caught in something she couldn't explain. She stepped toward him, her face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "It's not what you think," she began, her hands trembling. "I never meant for this to happen, Tom. I I don't know. It's complicated. Complicated, Tom repeated, his voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. You've been sleeping with him, Sam. That's as far from complicated as it gets. Samantha's face turned pale, and for a moment, it looked as if she would deny it. But the truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words seemed to die on her lips. Yeah, I've been seeing him, she admitted finally, her voice barely a whisper. It started off innocently. He was just a colleague, a friend. But I don't know what happened. I didn't want this, Tom. I never meant to hurt you. The weight of her words slammed into him like a tidal wave. For a moment, Tom could hardly breathe. He had spent months fighting against his doubts, his insecurities. But now, standing in front of him, was the truth, raw and jagged. He shook his head, trying to steady himself. You don't get it, Sam, he said, his voice hoarse. You don't get what you've done to us. To me. Samantha stepped back, her eyes wide with regret. But Tom could see that it was too late. The damage had been done. Trust, once broken, was not something you could just repair with apologies. He turned to leave, his heart breaking with every step. Before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at her, one last time. I'm done, Sam, he said, his voice barely audible. I can't do this anymore. With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him, and he stepped into the cold night air. The city that had once seemed full of promise now felt like an empty void. He had come here searching for answers, but all he had found was the truth, and it was more than he could bear. As he walked away, he didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't let her betrayal define him. He would rebuild, step by painful step, but he knew now that the road ahead would be one he had to walk alone. Tom's new apartment in Austin was a far cry from the spacious, shared home he had once loved. The walls were bare, save for a few photographs that now seemed like relics of a life he no longer recognized. He hadn't planned on moving so quickly after the divorce, but the decision had felt inevitable. Everything he had known, everything he had invested in, had been torn apart. The divorce papers had been signed, and now he was starting over. The apartment itself was modest, nothing luxurious. There were no grand furnishings or modern designs, just the basics. But there was a sense of freedom that came with the simplicity of it all. The quiet mornings, the solitary evenings, and the chance to rediscover who he was without the weight of betrayal constantly pressing down on him. He had started therapy soon after returning from London. The emotional toll had been greater than he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he was seeking in those sessions, but he knew he needed to confront the anger, the sadness, and the overwhelming sense of loss that had followed him for months. You're allowed to grieve, his therapist had said, but you're also allowed to heal, and part of healing is letting go of what was. At first, the idea of letting go seemed impossible. How could he move on from the life he had envisioned with Samantha? But slowly, day by day, Tom began to see the glimmer of something new, something that wasn't defined by his past. He rekindled his passion for photography, something he had put aside during his marriage. He began going on walks with his camera, capturing small moments in the world that he had once ignored. At first, it felt like a distraction, a way to fill the void. But as time passed, he found joy in the act of creation, in the focus it required. He was able to immerse himself in the lens, allowing his thoughts to slow, to take in the world around him with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The more he immersed himself in photography, the more he realized how much of himself he had lost during the course of his marriage. He had given so much of his identity to Samantha's career, to the idea of their life together, that he had forgotten what made him feel alive. By the time he launched his photography business, Tom had come a long way. He was no longer the man who stood frozen in the doorway of Samantha's apartment, heartbroken and shattered. He was a man reclaiming his life, his passions, and his peace. His business started small, with friends and family as his first clients, but he quickly gained momentum. There was something deeply satisfying about turning pain into creativity, about finding beauty in the world through his own eyes. Meanwhile, Samantha's world was beginning to unravel. The affair with Mark had not only strained her personal life but had also impacted her professional reputation. Rumors about the relationship had spread quickly within her company, and though she tried to brush them off, it was clear that her colleagues and clients no longer viewed her with the same respect. In the weeks following her confrontation with Tom, Samantha found herself at a crossroads. She was still in London, still buried in her work, but the consequences of her choices were beginning to catch up with her. She had been promoted, yes, but now her career felt hollow. Her achievements, which once felt like validation of everything she had worked for, now felt like empty victories. She tried to apologize to Tom, sending him messages, calling him, even flying back to Austin for a brief attempt at reconciliation, but every attempt was met with silence. Tom had drawn clear boundaries, no longer willing to play the part of the supportive husband. He had to let go, for his own sanity, for his own healing. Samantha found herself stuck in a professional environment that now felt hostile. Her work was suffering, and she began to question whether the path she had chosen, the very path that had led her to leave Tom, had been worth it. She had traded intimacy, trust, and her marriage for career advancement. But now, nothing seemed fulfilling. Her relationship with Mark, though it had been passionate and exciting at first, also began to fray. The magic that had come from their secret meetings faded into the mundane reality of living out the affair in the open, and soon enough, she found herself questioning everything. Was Mark really who she wanted? Or had she only used him to fill the void she had created by pushing Tom away? Tom's journey was difficult, but it was also one of liberation. He hadn't wanted to feel angry forever, hadn't wanted to be consumed by the betrayal. In therapy, he learned to let go of the need for closure from Samantha. Some questions, he realized, would never be answered. Some wounds would always remain, but they no longer had to define him. Tom began teaching photography workshops, offering a place for people to express themselves through the lens. He found fulfillment in helping others tap into their creativity, and his business began to grow. He was no longer just the man who had been left behind. He was someone new, someone who had rebuilt himself step by painful step. Though the past still lingered in his mind from time to time, Tom no longer let it control him. He had found a new purpose and with it a new sense of self. And while Samantha's struggles in London continued, Tom moved forward with quiet confidence, knowing that growth had emerged from the ashes of personal destruction. After everything had fallen apart, Tom had returned to his life in Austin, determined to rebuild. But there was one lingering thing that gnawed at him: Mark. The man who had been his wife's affair had never been a faceless enemy. Tom had learned too much about him, about the role Mark had played in the destruction of his marriage. He couldn't just let go without finding closure. One afternoon, as he was sorting through some old photographs, Tom received a message that would change everything. It was from Julia, Mark's wife. "I know who you are," her message began. "I know what Mark did, and I know it wasn't just me he hurt. Can we talk?" At first, Tom didn't know how to respond. He had considered seeking out Mark directly, but confronting the man felt like seeking revenge. Yet Julia's message intrigued him. They both shared the same experience: betrayal, heartbreak, and the aftermath of lives falling apart. Maybe talking to her would give him some peace. A week later, Tom found himself in London, standing outside the door of Julia's home. Her message had been brief but clear. She wanted to meet, to share her side of things. Tom wasn't sure what to expect. Was this a woman on the brink of vengeance, or someone who was simply looking for understanding? The home was opulent, the kind of place Mark's success had afforded them, a stark contrast to Tom's modest apartment in Austin. As he stepped inside, he was met by Julia, a woman who looked weary but composed. She offered him a seat, a glass of wine, and a sympathetic smile. "I don't know why I contacted you," Julia admitted, taking a seat opposite him. "I guess I wanted to know if you were angry, if you felt the way I did." Tom smiled bitterly, understanding the weight of her words. He hadn't come here looking for answers from Julia, but the connection between them was undeniable. Both of them had been betrayed by the people they loved. The pain they shared was palpable. "I've been angry for a long time," Tom said, his voice quiet. I'm still angry, but it's not just Mark I'm angry at. I'm angry at myself. For missing the signs. For not seeing what was happening to us. Julia nodded, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness that seemed to mirror his own. I've spent years looking for someone to blame, but the truth is Mark and we stopped seeing each other a long time ago. I just didn't know how to let go. The conversation flowed between them, a quiet bond forming as they exchanged their experiences. Julia, like Tom, had spent years trying to preserve something that was already gone. Her marriage had been built on illusions of perfection, and Mark had shattered that illusion with his affair. Not just with Samantha, but with others, Tom soon learned. Julia's hurt was still raw, and Tom understood it in ways that no one else could. There was a time I thought I had it all, Julia continued, her voice shaking. The perfect husband, the perfect life. But nothing's ever perfect, and I guess I was just too blind to see it. Tom felt a knot in his chest. He didn't want to pity Julia, and he knew she didn't want that either. But her words resonated with him more than he expected. The past, the lies, the betrayal, it all seemed so familiar. It was a reminder of everything he had lost, but also everything he was still fighting to rebuild. The conversation took a deeper turn when Julia finally asked him the question she'd been holding in. Have you forgiven Samantha? She asked gently. Tom's mind went blank for a moment. Forgiveness seemed so simple yet so elusive. No, he said finally, his voice firm. I don't think I ever will. Not for what she did. But I'm learning to move on. I'm learning to forgive myself. Julia smiled faintly. I think that's the only thing we can do. Move on, heal, and build something new. The weight of their shared experience lingered in the room. What had begun as a conversation rooted in mutual pain became something else. A moment of understanding, of empathy. They were two people who had been broken in the same way, and in some strange, unexpected way, that made them stronger together. By the end of the evening, Julia had made a decision. She confronted Mark the following day, demanding answers, but also taking control of her own future. The confrontation was tense, filled with years of unspoken anger, but ultimately, it was a necessary step in her healing process. The affair had shattered her marriage, but it had also given her the courage to reclaim her life. Tom left London with a new sense of clarity. His time with Julia had provided a kind of healing he hadn't expected. He had sought closure, but what he had found was something more. The realization that unexpected alliances could provide strength. There were others out there who had walked the same painful path, and through them he could find the strength to move forward, too. Back in Austin, Tom focused on what truly mattered, his photography business, his healing, and the relationships he was slowly building with people who valued him for who he was, not who he had been. As for Julia, her journey was far from over, but Tom knew that their connection had been an important step in both of their healing processes. They had shared their pain, and in doing so, had helped each other embrace the future with new hope. Tom felt the open road before him, a path leading not only through the expansive landscapes of the country, but into the unexplored corners of his heart and mind. It had been months since the end of his marriage, months since the last conversation with Samantha, and yet the echo of those painful moments still lingered. He needed something more than therapy and photography to truly heal. He needed a journey to reclaim himself and rediscover the person he had once been before all the turmoil. His destination was unclear, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the solitude, the chance to reflect, to be in the quiet company of himself. His car, packed with a few essentials, rolled through Texas, into the wide-open spaces of New Mexico, and onward to the mountains and deserts that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Each day on the road gave Tom the time and space to think about the last year, about Samantha, about Mark, about the life he thought he had and the life he was now learning to build. He pulled over at small diners, visited national parks, and made pit stops in small towns where he could breathe freely, away from the weight of everything he had lost. Along the way, he started a journal documenting his thoughts, his feelings, and the lessons he was learning. April 12th, New Mexico. I used to think that everything was supposed to fit together perfectly, that life was a series of carefully planned out steps, career, marriage, family. But nothing is perfect. I used to be afraid of the unknown. I'm not anymore. I think I've finally realized that I'm still the one who decides where I go next." The long hours on the road allowed Tom to sort through the confusion that had been his life for so long. He had felt lost for a while, his identity overshadowed by his relationship with Samantha, by the life they had built. But now, with every mile he put between himself and that life, he felt himself coming back into focus. Slowly, he found peace in the quiet of the journey. It wasn't just the places he visited or the memories he confronted that brought him peace. It was the freedom, the simple act of being on his own, without the weight of someone else's expectations. He had been someone else's partner for so long, but now he was his own person, and the thought brought a small, quiet satisfaction. April 22nd, Arizona. I've spent so much of my life trying to fix things, to make them better. But some things can't be fixed. I can't fix the past, and I can't fix what happened between Samantha and me. But I can fix my future. I can choose to make it better. One afternoon in Arizona, Tom stopped in a small town, where he found himself volunteering at a local shelter. The shelter was modest, offering food, shelter, and warmth to those who had nowhere else to turn. He had always been a giving person, but in the past, his contributions had often been tied to his image of being a perfect husband or a reliable partner. Now, though, helping others felt like a deeper connection to his own humanity. He wasn't just giving to fill a role. He was giving because he had learned what it meant to hurt, and he wanted to help others find the same healing he had found along the way. Samantha, on the other hand, was far from peace. From her luxurious London apartment, the city buzzed outside her window, a constant reminder of the world she had chosen over everything else. Yet, inside, she felt the weight of her decisions. She missed Tom, missed the life they had built together, even though she had been the one to push him away. The affair with Mark hadn't fixed anything. It had only made the emptiness more pronounced. The more she tried to reconcile the life she had wanted with the life she had created, the more distant she felt from the person she used to be. Samantha's days in London were filled with work, but the thrill of the project, the prestige, no longer brought her the joy she once thought it would. There was no joy in the late-night meetings or the constant travel. She had built a life in a city that was brimming with ambition and success, but she was realizing too late that what she had sacrificed in the process was something irreplaceable. She reached out to Tom, but the messages were met with silence. She sent him an email, offering an apology, explaining the guilt she felt. She told him that she missed him, but Tom had moved on. He had found peace within himself and had drawn firm boundaries. May 3rd, California. Samantha reached out today. It was everything I expected. Apologetic, remorseful, filled with regret. I've been there, I've heard it all before. But I'm done. I'm done looking back. I'm finally starting to see that I'm worth more than the pain I've been carrying. By the time Tom reached the Pacific coast, he felt like a different person, a version of himself that had been buried for far too long. He wasn't the broken man who had once walked away from Samantha's betrayal. He wasn't the confused person trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He was a man who had faced his pain and walked through it. He was someone who had found purpose again, in his work and in his new connections with people. He had learned that true healing didn't come from apologies or answers from others. It came from inside. It came from self-reflection, from choosing to embrace new beginnings, and from recognizing that the future could be something he had control over. Meanwhile, in London, Samantha faced the personal costs of her choices. Her career was in a delicate position, her personal life in turmoil. The joy she once found in her achievements felt hollow. Mark, who had once seemed like an answer to her loneliness, was not the man she had hoped he would be. The affair had come at a price. Not just the end of her marriage, but the loss of her own identity in the process. In the distance of a few thousand miles, both Tom and Samantha were learning the same truth. True healing doesn't come through holding on to the past, no matter how painful. It comes from letting go, moving forward, and creating something new from the ashes of what was once lost. Tom sat at a small table in a cozy cafe in Brooklyn, New York, the clinking of coffee cups and quiet hum of conversation filling the air. It had been months since he last saw Julia, but their bond remained fresh in his mind. After their time together in London, Tom had returned to Austin, focused on rebuilding his life. Yet, there was a lingering curiosity about Julia, a woman who had been through her own pain, but had found a way to move forward. Julia had invited him to meet in New York, a place that, for both of them, held its own promise of new beginnings. As Tom sipped his coffee, the realization hit him. Their connection wasn't just about shared pain. There was something more, something unexpected. And now, sitting across from Julia in the energy of the city, he couldn't deny it any longer. "How are you really doing?" Julia asked, her voice gentle but knowing. She could see the change in Tom, the way he carried himself with more ease than before. It wasn't the fragile man who had confronted his wife's betrayal in London. No, this was someone different. Tom smiled softly. "Better. Still a work in progress, but I'm doing okay. How about you? How have you been?" Julia's expression softened, her eyes revealing the weight of her own journey. "It's been hard," she said. "I won't lie. But I've learned that healing isn't linear. Some days are better than others. But I've started focusing on what I can control. My life, my future." She paused, looking down at her hands, a quiet confidence in her voice. "I started my own business, doing something I've always wanted to do. The still early days, but it's been fulfilling. It's been about rediscovering who I am, separate from Mark." Tom could hear the pride in her voice, but he also understood the struggle. Rebuilding after betrayal was never easy, and though Julia had found a new sense of purpose, the scars from her past still lingered. Yet, there was hope in her words, and that was something Tom hadn't seen from her the last time they spoke. "It sounds like you're finding your way," Tom remarked. "I'm glad to hear it." Their conversation shifted as they shared more about their new lives. Tom talked about his photography business, how he had turned his passion into a thriving career, and how he had found joy in helping others through his workshops. Julia, in turn, spoke about her work and the joy she felt in helping others find creative expression, just as she had. As they spoke, a natural bond developed, built not just on their shared experiences, but on their mutual desire for growth and renewal. The more they talked, the more Tom realized how deeply they understood each other. The complexities of love, betrayal, and the paths they had to walk alone before finding their way back to themselves. Later that afternoon, they decided to take a walk through Central Park, the city's energy surrounding them as they strolled along the winding paths. The air was cool, and the colors of the trees and flowers reminded Tom of the vibrancy that life still held. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace in the present. They found a quiet spot to sit, overlooking a pond. As they settled down on the grass, Julia looked over at Tom, her eyes searching. "Do you ever think about the future? About what's next for you?" Tom leaned back, taking in the view. He'd thought about the future many times, but never quite like this. He had focused on healing, on building something solid again. But what did it mean to look forward with hope? "I do," he replied. "And for the first time, it feels less like an obligation and more like an opportunity. An opportunity to be who I really am." Julia nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I think that's the key. We can't move forward until we accept who we are now, after everything that's happened." A comfortable silence settled between them, and Tom realized how easy it had been to talk to Julia. They understood each other in a way that few others could. Their shared experiences, their mutual rebuilding, had created a strong foundation for something deeper. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. As they stood to leave, walking side by side through the park, Tom felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the city, the shared connection, or simply the moment they were in, but there was a sense of possibility in the air. The kind of possibility that only came when two people, once broken, found each other in a place where healing could happen together. Julia looked over at him, her smile warm. "I'm glad we met today, Tom. I feel like this is the start of something really good." Tom smiled back, the weight of the past feeling lighter than it had in months. "Yeah, me too." It had been a year since Tom's life had shifted in ways he never imagined. In that time, he had healed, rediscovered his passions, and built a new life alongside Julia. Their relationship had blossomed from shared pain into a bond rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and a shared desire for new beginnings. Now, as the evening light faded over their cozy apartment in New York, the two of them stood together, preparing for a dinner with close friends to celebrate this new chapter. The apartment, filled with plants, photographs, and soft lighting, reflected the warmth they had built together. Laughter echoed from the kitchen as Julia stirred the pot of homemade soup, while Tom adjusted the music in the background. "Everything looks perfect," Julia said, her smile warm as she looked around their home. Tom stepped up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "It's because we've made it that way," he said, his voice soft but sure. "Together." As they set the table, Tom couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The man who had once walked through the cold streets of London, heartbroken and lost, was now standing here, in a place filled with love, with someone who truly understood him. His photography business had grown, his workshops had helped others find creative expression, and most importantly, he had found peace within himself. Julia, too, had grown stronger. Her own business was flourishing, and she had found a sense of purpose she hadn't realized was missing. They had both come a long way, from shattered pieces to a renewed sense of self. And now, as they prepared for this dinner, it felt like a celebration of all they had built. Their friends arrived, and the evening unfolded with ease. The conversations were light, filled with warmth and shared laughter, and Tom found himself at ease with the people who had come to know him in this new chapter of his life. He was no longer weighed down by the past. He was simply living in the present, embracing all that the future had to offer. Later that evening, as the last of their guests left, Tom sat on the couch next to Julia, the glow of the city lights filtering through their window. Julia turned to him, her eyes filled with affection. "This is our life now, Tom," she said softly. "We've found something real, something beautiful." Tom smiled, a sense of contentment filling him. "I've never felt more alive. I think it's because I finally let go of everything that held me back." As they sat in the quiet of their apartment, the bond between them stronger than ever, Tom's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, recognizing the name immediately. Samantha. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the message. It was short, simple. "Tom, I know I've hurt you. I'm sorry. Can we talk?" For a moment, the past seemed to resurface in a wave of memories. The hurt, the betrayal, the endless questions. But as quickly as the emotions flooded in, Tom realized how far he had come. The man who had once searched for answers was no longer the same person. He had found his own peace, his own strength, and it didn't need to be validated by someone who had betrayed him. He set the phone down and turned to Julia, who had been watching him with quiet understanding. "You okay?" she asked gently. Tom smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. "Yeah, I'm more than okay." He picked up his phone again and typed a simple response to Samantha. "I've healed, Sam. I've moved on, and I'm in a better place now. I wish you well." He put the phone down and, with a deep breath, turned his focus back to Julia. They had both chosen to embrace new beginnings, and that was all that mattered now. Samantha's message was a reminder that, while the past may try to creep back in, true redemption comes in letting go and moving forward. As Tom sat back next to Julia, he reflected on his journey. He had walked through pain, through loneliness, through uncertainty, but he had emerged stronger, more whole, and finally at peace. His future was no longer defined by what he had lost but by the beauty of the new beginnings he had embraced. And as he looked forward, there was a sense of excitement, a sense of hope. The future, he realized, was filled with endless possibilities.